In this video, I'd like to go through what I call the 3 levels of problem solving and why the results you get when you're dealing with a problem, for example, an illness or some upsetting event, are determined by the approach you take. And we're going to be looking in this video at 3 different approaches. And I'd like to start with this quote by Rumi, which by the end of this presentation may make more sense than at the start. And it's one of my favorite quotes. He says, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." And then the quote also continues, "When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about." So what does this mean? I'll just repeat the whole thing. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. And what this is really saying is that if we go beyond the mental concepts of right doing and wrong doing, we'll find ourselves in a new place where there is no right doing or wrong doing. And that is a place to get to. And that is a place of transformation from where we will see things in a totally different light. And in general, most people are too caught up in their problems to go beyond to this other place. So let's look at these levels of problem solving. And an easy way to look at it is to look at things as if they're on a continuum. And this continuum has 3 choices. And these choices really are about the levels of self-responsibility we're willing to take over the issue that we're trying to deal with. And to make things simple, we can say that there are 3 levels of self-responsibility. And these levels are low to medium to high. In other words, we can take a low level of self-responsibility, a medium level, or a high level of self-responsibility. And the degree to which we do this is going to radically change our outcomes. So first of all, if we look at low responsibility, this is where we have little or no self-responsibility for taking our part in what has happened. And this is very predominant in our world today. In particular, you tend to see it in the media, or if something goes wrong that's reported in the media, and immediately they will be wanting to find somebody to blame. There's always got to be somebody to blame. And one of the things to be aware of with this low level of self-responsibility is that the focus will always be outward. It will be outward at something or someone else. In other words, someone or something did something to us. It is not our fault. We don't have to take responsibility. In fact, we don't believe we have any responsibility, or maybe just a small amount of responsibility, and most of the blame lays outside of us. And then we start moving along this continuum and we get to medium self-responsibility, where we are starting to take self-responsibility and ownership of what has happened. And that requires that we come inwards, because you can't take self-responsibility without coming inside and being more aware of one's feelings or one's thoughts or one's actions. There has to be a coming inwards. And then the high level of self-responsibility is absolute total self-responsibility, where one takes 100% responsibility for what has happened in that situation. Now, that doesn't mean, as you're going to see, that the other person does not also have to take some responsibility. But there is a difference between a good degree of self-responsibility and absolute self-responsibility. And you will see what that means as I go through this presentation. And as I said before, on the low end, we could call this the blame game. And then as we move into the medium part of self-responsibility, then we're growing our self-awareness. And as we get to these higher levels of self-responsibility, we could call this soul surrender, where we're surrendering to something bigger than just our personality and tapping into something bigger than just our personality. And again, this will make sense as I go through this presentation. And actually, we can equate these three levels to what level of our being we are connecting in with and operating from. So on the low end, where we're taking little or no self-responsibility, this is primarily when people are stuck in their mind. They're stuck in their logical thinking mind, trying to find a solution, thinking all the time, overthinking. And this can keep us stuck because our mind is limited. But then when we start bringing in our emotions and our feelings and dealing with our emotions and our feelings and getting in touch with our emotions, taking responsibility for how we're feeling, learning how to manage our feelings, this will bring us into a much greater degree of self-responsibility and self-awareness. And so we move into medium level of self-responsibility. But if we want to get to the high total self-responsibility, this is the realm of what we may call spirit. Now, spirit can be quite an emotive word because everybody has their own version of what spirit means to them. We all have our own religious traditions. Maybe we're not religious at all, but maybe we have our own philosophy. So I just want you to take the word spirit to mean some greater higher power, something beyond the personality, and whatever that means for you. So just to recap, we have these three levels of responsibility, low, medium, high, which relate directly to mind, emotions, and spirit. So let's look in greater detail at these three levels of self-responsibility, the mind, emotions, and spirit. Firstly, the mind. The mind really, when we're dealing with a problem, it's our logical thinking, sometimes going into overthinking, sometimes ruminating when we're just going over and over and over. As I said before, blame, looking external, fault finding, right, wrong, and very much getting stuck in the story and stuck in our head at a mental level. And this is very limiting because it keeps us limited due to the fact that we're only seeing a limited version of things, and there is much more than the mind to us and to other people. And if we're only dealing with things with our mind, that is going to lead to a limited solution, as you're going to see with the examples that I'm going to be showing in a moment. And then if we look at bringing in the emotions, this means that we start to really become aware of what we're feeling, to own our feelings, to start to look at the deeper hidden meaning behind those feelings, which in my trainings I call the surface and the deep. In other words, whatever is happening in the now is usually a repeat from the past. For example, if we get upset in the now over a situation, it's because that current situation is merely triggering something inside of us which is unresolved from the past, which was similar, some similar experience, some similar emotions. So we start to investigate these deeper hidden meanings, and we start to become more self-aware, and we start to recognize that when we have these life challenges, they're actually what we could call a life lesson. It is life bringing us a lesson that we need to learn. And until we actually master that lesson, life will keep bringing us that lesson again and again and again, which is why we will draw similar people to us over and over again until we get the lesson that life is asking us to learn. And in this place, we're going to probably have to do some emotional healing. We may have to heal the past. And in so doing, as we move through this emotional processing, this emotional healing, healing of the past, learning about ourselves, understanding the deeper hidden meaning, then we will start to get what we could call the gift in the whole situation, which when it first started, when we were first faced with this challenge, felt like the worst possible thing that could be happening to us. And initially, if we're at the mind level of self-responsibility, we will be doing a lot of resisting of what is and resisting that challenge. But as soon as we start moving into the emotional level, then we start to look deeper, start to look at what the lesson is, and eventually we get the gift. But then if we move into the spirit level, we're going to go even deeper. And this is when we start going into a surrendering into the heart, at a heart level, where we start letting go of the deep patterns inside of us, which have been running us our whole life, which mostly we've been unconscious of. And we're going to start surrendering to a bigger part of ourselves that is beyond the personality, which we could call the soul, maybe in some people's language. Other people may allude to it as true self, higher power, whatever that is for you. But we start to connect in with and unify with a bigger part of ourselves, which when we're stuck in the mind and the personality, we're mostly unaware of. And in order to move into this realm of spirit, we're going to have this radical honesty and this radical self-responsibility. And that is going to include, for example, letting go of pride and letting go of fear and letting go of what has prevented us up until now being able to connect in with this higher part of ourselves. So let's look at the results that we're going to get with each of these levels of self-responsibility. Well, if we're operating just from the mind, we're stuck in our mind, we're stuck in the story, we're thinking, we're in the blame game, fault finding, right, wrong, all that sort of stuff, then very often we're going to find ourselves stuck in that problem with little or no resolution, because it's actually really hard to solve a problem fully from only the mental level. But if we start to bring in the emotional level, then we're going to start to have emotional resolution, which is going to bring us inner peace and also this learning that we get as we get the gift. And the interesting thing is, one of the main reasons that people stay stuck at the mind level is because they're afraid of facing their feelings, but they don't know it. And this is because we've been conditioned from a very early age to unconsciously be afraid of feeling our feelings. How many times, for example, were you told, be quiet, don't cry, whatever you were told when you started to get upset as a little child? Or how many times did you see your parents not dealing with their emotions? Or how many times did you feel afraid when you saw your parents exhibiting emotions, for example, such as anger or deep grief, but they didn't really know how to deal with their own emotions, and that therefore left you feeling scared of dealing with your own emotions? There are many, many reasons as to why we unconsciously learn to be afraid of our feelings. And actually, one of the core fears for a human being is the fear of feeling feelings fully. And another core fear is the fear of feeling vulnerable. So we grow up, and without realizing it, we are afraid of feeling our feelings. And that would be all these uncomfortable types of feelings, such as fear, anger, sadness, loneliness, disappointment, upset, hurt, betrayal, all these different feelings. We're afraid of feeling them, and we don't know how to process them. And that keeps us stuck at the mental level. And that's why so many people stay stuck in their head and they're unable to be connected into their body. But when we start to learn how to deal with our feelings, then life changes. And we are no longer afraid of our feelings. We know how to identify them and how to process them. And that changes everything. And as I said, in a moment, I'm going to be giving some concrete examples and you'll see what I mean by this. And then if we move into the realm of spirit, where we are surrendering at a much deeper level into our heart, into our true self, our soul self, then the results will be even more profound. And we will move from emotional resolution and inner calm and peace into a much deeper state of inner peace and deep transformation. So the question is, what do you want? Where do you want to be in your life? And how do you want to deal with the challenges that you are faced with? Because the reality is, we're always going to be faced with challenges. Those challenges don't stop. I remember 10, 20 years ago having a utopian expectation that at some point in my life I wouldn't have any more problems. And that was really quite an ignorant and unaware place to be. And often we can think, oh, well, if I sort this, and this out, then I'm never going to have any more life problems. But that's not how life works. And the key is to be able to deal with those problems when they arise. And the more tools we have under our belt, and the more self-aware we are, and the more we're able to move along this continuum to be able to deal with things at an emotional and spiritual level, the easier it is to deal with life problems. But we do have to go through this journey. And the intermediary, if you like, is the emotions. We have to become aware of our feelings and master our feelings. So what do you want? Do you want to be stuck at the mind level, where you're stuck in the blame game and the right wrong and the thinking and the overthinking? Or are you ready and open to get into emotional awareness, emotional intelligence, and to start becoming much more aware of your feelings and learning how to manage and master your feelings so that you can experience internal resolution at an emotional level so that that situation is no longer triggering you? And do you want to go even beyond that, more into the realm of soul and spirit, where you're really getting deep transformation? Because we have a choice, and all the tools and the strategies are here to help us to get from point 1 to point 2 to point 3. So let's look at some examples, because this really makes it real and much more understandable, because up until now, obviously, I've just been talking theory, but let's look at some practical examples of what this really means. And example 1 is what I would call a disappointment, aka feelings of betrayal, but not deep betrayal in this particular example, but definitely a disappointment, which created an emotional response and created a challenging situation. And these examples are real things that happened to me, which I had to work through at a very deep level, which gave me the understanding that I'm able to share in this presentation. So first of all, I'll explain what happened, and then I'll explain how this relates to these 3 levels: mental, emotional, spiritual. So the situation was, I was in a committee and 2 of us had been assigned a task to do with organizing an event. And I was due to work with one particular person on this task, and they were going to do part A, and then once they'd done that, they were going to turn it over to me to do part B. And I can't remember now what the task was. It's irrelevant, but the point was that they were going to do the first part, then they were going to hand it over to me, and I would do the second part. And a day after the meeting, I got an email from this person saying, I've done my part and I've also done your part. Now, this isn't obviously a big issue. We're not talking like a world war here, but nevertheless, as you probably know, seemingly insignificant things can happen which trigger seemingly big responses inside you. And this is because we have unresolved emotional hurts from the past inside of us, which are triggered by events in our current life. So when I received this email saying that my task had been done, I felt disappointed and a little annoyed because I was looking forward to doing the task that I had volunteered to do. And I simply sent an email back to this person expressing the truth of how I felt, just saying I'd feel a little disappointed and frustrated because I was looking forward to doing my part of the task, and I wish that you had spoken to me first. And I got a blistering email back in response, and I can no longer remember the content, but let's just say this person totally laid into me, said I was completely overreacting, and went on for paragraphs about my ridiculous response and said, don't bother talking to me for at least 3 months. And this person was a friend. They weren't just somebody that we were on a committee together with, they were a friend. And as a result of receiving this communication from this friend, I felt deeply hurt, disappointed, and even betrayed. And it triggered something very, very deep inside of me. Now, let me show you these 3 levels of dealing with the situation and the difference that it makes as you deal with a situation like this on each of these 3 levels. So, as we know, the first level is the mind, the logical thinking, the overthinking, the blaming, the fault finding, the right wrong, staying stuck in the story. So initially, for the first 2 days after I received this email, the response that I had was thinking and overthinking about what I'd read in this email, feeling very upset, feeling a lot of emotions, feeling hurt, betrayed, frustrated, angry. I was going into the right wrong story of they shouldn't have done this, they were wrong to do that, etc. I stayed stuck in that place for 2 days. And the result of staying stuck in that place was sleepless nights, staying stuck in the story in my head, incessant thoughts, no inner peace, and really not having an enjoyable 2 days and getting very little done because all I could think of was this situation that had just happened. Now, I'm sure you can probably relate to an incident that's happened in your life where you've been upset or you felt upset by something that somebody has done or something that has happened, and it has taken away your peace of mind, and you may have spent hours or days or maybe even months stuck in that place with no resolution. And so you know what that feels like and you know the consequences of that, and it's not a pleasant place to be. And the reason that we stay stuck in that place is because we're stuck in our mind, and the mind does not have all the solutions. Now, fortunately, I knew some solutions and I knew better. And after a couple of days, I sat myself down and I said, okay, Kim, it's time to get out of the story. And this is really, really important, really important. If you want to move on to the next level, into the emotional level, you're going to have to stop the story. And you're going to have to start to get into your feelings. So when we start getting into the feelings, then we're going to start owning what we feel. We're going to start looking at the deeper hidden meaning and messages of what is going on. We're going to become more aware. As I mentioned before, we're going to start coming inwards. We have to come inwards. And so I sat myself down and I asked myself, what am I really feeling? Just irrespective of whatever the mind is trying to say, and the mind's just going on and on and on, trying to find an answer, trying to blame, I'm going to put that all aside and I'm just going to stop and ask myself the question, What is it that I'm really feeling right now? And as soon as I did that, I tapped into deep, deep feelings of hurt and betrayal, which went way further than just this little insignificant event that had happened in the now. And it's a bit like going beneath the surface of the sea. If you have the iceberg analogy, where you have the iceberg above the sea, just the tip of the iceberg, and that is the mind. But then once you go below and you have the mass of the iceberg underneath, that's when you really start to tap into the real stuff. And I started tapping into these feelings, which I had been unconsciously trying to avoid by staying stuck in my mind and in my head. And this is what happens if we stay stuck in the mind, we are unconsciously avoiding what we're truly feeling. And I started to get in touch with these deep feelings of hurt and betrayal, and I started to give myself permission to feel them and to process them and to clear them. And it was an unusually intense experience. We don't often or always or usually have to go through such an intense experience to clear emotions, but this happened to be a particularly intense experience. And it lasted for about 3 days, where huge amounts of sadness and grief and hurt were coming out of me, so to speak, through crying and through feeling this deep emotional pain in my heart. But after I had gone through this, 3 days later, I felt like a completely new person. And actually, the analogy that I used at the time was it felt like my heart had been sliced open and venom was coming out. That was the analogy that came to me at the time. So I had been holding this venomous pain inside of me without even knowing it. And this seemingly innocuous situation had triggered this pain to come to the surface so that life was giving me the opportunity to heal. And this was the gift. This was the gift. The healing of this old emotional pain was the gift. And the result was deep healing, emotional resolution, the story dissolving, restoring harmony, obviously sleeping much better, and then being able to get on with life because there was no story anymore in my head. There was no right wrong story anymore because I went deep enough to see the gift and the lesson. And this is the gift of being able to deal with our emotions and to see this deeper level of why we get upset. But if we take it to the spirit level, which, as I said, is about unification or meeting our true self, our higher self, going much deeper into our heart. And at the time, I hadn't learned some of the tools that I now have where I could have dealt with this on this level. But if we go more into this level of dealing with a challenge like this, then yes, it includes letting go of the story completely and searching for what we call the underlying fundamental pattern of consciousness, which lies deep within us, which drives these unconscious emotional mental responses. And when we're able to deal with things at this level, then we get even deeper insights and transformation of consciousness and transformation of these deep fundamental patterns, and we really start to become a new person. So we could say that this is a furtherance of the emotional level of managing this life situation. So let me give another example, which I will call disrespectful treatment, and how this applies to these 3 levels. So first of all, I will explain what the situation was and then apply these 3 levels of dealing with this situation to it. So the situation was, I found myself being what I would call bullied and controlled by a work colleague. And the interesting thing about being bullied or abused or controlled by people is that it usually happens if we've experienced that somewhere in the past. Because when we've experienced that type of trauma or abuse as a child, and that's where it usually starts, we create certain behaviors and we have a certain energetic frequency which attracts a similar type of situation into our life later on. And that is why, for example, people will find themselves in an abusive or dysfunctional relationship. It's because it's very similar to something that happened to them in their childhood. Now, I've dealt with this topic quite a lot during my life. I was in an abusive relationship, which I had no idea was an abusive, dysfunctional relationship until I started to understand that actually this type of behavior was not normal or acceptable. It took me about a year to extricate myself from that relationship, and it was, again, a huge gift and a huge learning, and I'm very grateful for it, because if I hadn't gone through that situation, I wouldn't have learned what I learned, and I wouldn't have been able to help other people go through that type of situation as well. And as I realized at the time, the reason I attracted that person into my life was because I had experienced a similar type of treatment in my childhood. Now, I thought I had done that lesson. I thought I was done with it. But many years later, I found myself in a situation where I was being bullied and disrespected and controlled by a work colleague. And the really tricky thing with these types of experiences is if we've had this trauma in childhood, it can set up a lot of confusion over what is right or wrong, or what is acceptable or non-acceptable treatment from another human being. And we have to do a lot of work usually to really learn to re-trust that when our body is telling us that something doesn't feel right, then it's okay to believe it and to trust it, and to really trust that if the body is saying this doesn't feel right, then to believe it. So I found myself in a situation where I was being disrespected and being treated unkindly, unfairly, and essentially being bullied. So let's look at the 3 levels of how to deal with this. So as we know, the initial response of the mind will be the thinking, the ruminating, the blame, the fault finding, the right, wrong, and getting stuck in the story. So for a short while, I was stuck in the right, wrong story and the emotions of the upset and the anger. And if I had stayed there, which fortunately I didn't, but if I had stayed there, then the result would have been more emotions, more upset, more anger, and just staying stuck and not having inner peace and having no resolution. Fortunately, because when this happened, I had a lot of tools under my belt and a lot of awareness to recognize the deeper meaning of why these events happen, my response was still feeling traumatized and upset and hurt and disappointed. And also there was some confusion because of past events. But I immediately knew that there must be a deeper meaning and a deeper lesson. And I immediately started to process my emotions. And I also got some professional help to help me see clarity on the situation. And the confusion, as I said, was because of the past abuse, and it was triggering some old beliefs and old confusion that still needed clearing, and that was part of the lesson. So I had some help. I had my own self-processing tools for processing emotions, and as a result of doing all of that, I had some deep emotional healing, emotional clearing, and I got the deeper lesson and the gift, which was I have a right to stand up for myself. I have a right not to be mistreated by other people, and I can trust the feedback from my gut, and I have a right to say no to unfair treatment, and I have power over my choices. I don't have to be dictated to by somebody else. And that brought inner power, and also inner peace. If we were to go into the spiritual level and go one step further, then again, we will be looking at, well, what is the pattern? What is the underlying pattern here that is at play? And how can I surrender more to my true self to get an even bigger learning? And letting go completely of all right and wrong. And when we do that, then we get even deeper healing and transformation of consciousness and the soul lessons and the soul learning, which goes beyond just the emotional healing. And just to give you one example of one of these patterns, which we call the patterns of consciousness, that was probably at play in this situation, one of the patterns is what we call fixed expectations. And when we have a fixed expectation, it means that we expect things to be a certain way. So how often in your life do you expect things to be a certain way, or people to behave a certain way, or expect a certain outcome? This is such a common pattern. And it's one of the reasons why we get frustrated and upset, because if things don't go our way and we're attached to things going a certain way, or we're attached to people behaving a certain way, then we're going to get upset and frustrated and annoyed and whatever emotional response we have. So as you can see, this is why it is so important to be able to deal with things at an emotional level and be self-aware of our emotions and be able to clear those emotions. But also, it's really useful to be able to know, well, what is the underlying pattern behind my emotional response? What is the pattern behind my mental habits of thinking? These are what we call the patterns of consciousness. And according to the trainings that I've done, there are 10 fundamental patterns of consciousness. And so it's really useful to learn, well, what are these patterns of consciousness? And then to clear those patterns of consciousness themselves. And then we will no longer be responding in the same way when situations happen, because these patterns won't be triggered. So what we have to remember is that this is a step-by-step journey. We start off normally fairly unconscious, where we're at the mind level, we're trying to use our mind to solve our problems, and of course that is very limiting. And the reason it's limiting is because we're excluding our emotional self and our spiritual self. So we stay stuck in the blame game. But as soon as we start moving into emotions and we start taking responsibility for how we're feeling, and we start coming inwards and really getting in touch with the truth of what is going on inside us and feeling our feelings and understanding, oh, okay, the reason I'm feeling like this is because XYZ happened to me in my past, and this is a repeat. And then we learn how to clear those emotions through self-help tools, or we get help to do that from somebody else. Then we start to find the peace and the resolution that we truly want. Because even if we think we're wanting to be right and we're wanting the other person to be wrong, which is where we are at the mind level, that's actually not what we really want. What we really want is the emotional resolution. But then if we go one step further, we're actually wanting to clear things at a much deeper level, at a heart level, a soul level, where we are willing to die to our old patterns and we're willing to transform into a new version of ourselves. And this is the journey of evolution of the human soul. So the question is, what do you choose and what do you want? Where do you want to be on this spectrum? Do you want to be in the mind? Do you want to move into the emotions? Or do you want to move into spirit? And if I come back to this saying now from Rumi, does this have different meaning for you? Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Does this have new meaning for you now? Now, if you want to learn more on how to deal with these type of life challenges, there's a couple of options that I can offer. The first level is the emotional level, which are the programs that I offer at the Emotional Alchemy Academy. And I have many different programs, but part of the training is what I call the 7 levels of emotional alchemy, which are the 7 signature trainings. So let me take you through them very briefly. The first level is the foundation level, where you learn deep emotional intelligence theory and how to identify emotions and the meaning and the purpose of emotions and where they're stored and generated inside your body. And you learn about emotional needs and what emotional needs were met in your childhood or not, and a whole heap of more information, which would take too long to go into now at the end of this video. The second level is emotional processing, where you actually learn specific, practical self-help techniques for clearing your own emotions, all sorts of emotions: anger, sadness, hurt, betrayal, disappointment, anxiety, depression, guilt, shame, and more. And the third level of training is the connection between emotions and stress, because there is a deep connection between negative emotions and stress. And this is really a de-stress training and a very, very thorough stress management or stress reduction training. And the level 4 training is emotional empowerment. And this is all about creating clear boundaries around unfair treatment, assertiveness training, learning to say no without feeling guilty, learning to say yes to you, learning to prioritize yourself without feeling guilty, putting a stop to unfair treatment from other people, whatever that unfair treatment is, whether it's minor or major, and also learning how to increase your self-care and your self-love, because that is a big part, believe it or not, of learning how to create boundaries and take better care of yourself. The level 5 training is how to reverse symptoms of chronic illness by identifying the hidden emotions and the hidden messages beneath the symptoms which have caused the symptoms or the illness. And in my experience, 99% of illness is due to unresolved emotional hurts. And it's not just the hurts we need to clear. We need to learn how to behave differently, how to think differently, how to feel differently, how to identify and process those emotions which are hiding underneath the symptoms. And then the level 6 training, we start getting more into the mind, to beliefs, behaviors, and how these all relate to emotions. So these are 6 of the 7 levels of the Emotional Alchemy signature programs. And these will give you deep insights and understanding and strategies on how to manage and master your emotions, so that you become very emotionally adept, very emotionally literate, unafraid to face your emotions, and become more and more unaffected by emotions. This is the goal of these programs. And then the second thing that I can offer is what I call the transformation of patterns training. And this comes from many, many years of Qigong training, and in particular training in the last 10 years in a system called Ren Shui and Wang Gong, where you learn specific techniques for transforming your patterns of consciousness. And the first thing that you're going to be doing is cultivating what we call the 5 essential qualities of the heart, in order to create what we call a barrier-free heart, an open heart. And this is actually the prerequisite, if you like, to the patterns training. And then once you get into the patterns training, then you're learning how to transform the patterns of consciousness, so that we can really say, I'm ready to welcome a different me every day. So I encourage you to sign up for the free foundation training, which will be free for a limited time only, on my training program called Change Your Patterns, Change Your Destiny. And in this program, you're going to be learning about the patterns of human nature or human consciousness, and why it's going to benefit you to change and transform these patterns. And we're going to be going through topics such as the 4 treasures of human life, introducing the concept of the false self versus the true self, and looking at the 5 essential qualities of the heart consciousness, looking at a model of changing patterns of consciousness, and a lot more. So if you're interested in coming along on this foundation training, then go to daohealthqigong.com, which is TAO, health, Qigong, which is QIGONG.com, and register for the free foundation training on changing your patterns of consciousness called Change Your Patterns, Change Your Destiny. I look forward to seeing you there.